Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. A couple of weeks ago, I sat in on a leadership meeting where we were doing a dashboard review, and one of the questions had come up about a specific metric that we were tracking. And as soon as we kind of dove in, what ultimately appeared as something that was slipping and something that needed immediate attention, as soon as we kind of dove into the details, what we actually unpacked is the fact that the number itself, the KPI that we were tracking, was ultimately a bit misleading. Right. So just because we've identified a metric and it's on the dashboard and it appears as though it is, a topic of discussion, doesn't necessarily mean that it's telling you the whole entire truth. And that's not just what I want to talk about today, but ultimately how it ties back to the bigger idea or the larger conversation around leading and lagging indicators or metrics. Right. So the specific example was around a number of orders in a specific queue for one particular department. And so we thought we were, tracking the correct KPI. And upon further review, what we ultimately ended up discovering is that we were tracking at the line level and not necessarily the number of orders. Right. And so why that was so impactful and how it ultimately ended up kind of highlighting a bigger issue in the sense of, what do we really want these metrics to do for us? What conversations do we want them to drive? What's the output? What's the intended kind of outcome that we're seeking when we're actually going through and reviewing these metrics, right? Like what action are we supposed to take? And so the situation was because we were taking a look at the line level detail and not the next level up, the order summary, if you will, we were kind of getting a false positive. And the scenario was that we had some really complex orders in the queue, which meant additional lines, which meant that particular KPI was kind of out of range, right? So it required a conversation. And so it just goes to highlight, it's a great example because it goes to highlight, just because we've identified something, we want to ultimately understand what is, what action are we going to take to ultimately, influence that particular KPI. And how this ties back to the leading and lagging indicators conversation is just that, so often we're kind of talking about things and reviewing them and not necessarily utilizing them, especially in like a weekly or, relatively regular, leadership type meeting, right? Like, what are we actually going to do now? And, so it's kind of like I always joke, it's I always sit down and, and I have the ability to get to sit in on a lot of these different leadership meetings, not just for this particular client, but for several of them. And, often we're talking about, things that don't actually result in action. Right. So if we have the opportunity to define metrics and take a look at things, that's what I'm always pushing towards. I'm always pushing towards how do we, especially on these regular cadence meetings, right? How do we identify leading indicators that ultimately drive action, right? Because ideally, that's what we want to be able to understand. If, let's say, I've got another client that we just had this conversation recently with, but, let's say that we are trying to ultimately, increase revenue. All right. This other company we were talking through and they were explaining to me that, they have a regular sales meeting every week. They talk about activities and, kind of roadblocks and, all of that type of thing. But what they're not measuring is, it's like, what's the output? And then how do we change our actions to be able to influence that output, right? So I encourage them to switch to what one of my other clients does, which is track how many meetings were booked, right? So it's a very quick indicator to understand, did our actions lead to a result, right? Lead to an outcome, booked meetings that we believe in the long term will result in additional revenue, right? Additional conversations, additional quotes, additional opportunities, ultimately additional closed revenue, right? So it's just a couple of really great examples of how the KPI conversation or scorecard conversation needs to be a lot deeper than most people kind of give it credit for. So depending on where you sit in the org, it can be easy to, want to just pick up on, revenue or on-time delivery percentages or, even like quote win rates or customer satisfaction. And not that those metrics aren't as meaningful, but depending on your meeting cadence, depending on, again, like what's the intended outcome, right? So if we're going to have a meeting that we want to identify actions, whether that's, hey, we need to get additional resources put towards this thing. Hey, we need to, change our process for this type of thing, right? If we want to have a regular cadence meeting that drives those types of activities, right, to ultimately influence the bigger picture, the greater good outcome that we're driving towards, from my perspective, it all drives back to what we're measuring to be able to do that. And so if you don't do that in a meaningful way, if you don't do that in a collaborative way, and you don't really dive into the details of things, I mean, for years, I've seen these types of meetings just be a complete time waste for everybody. Leadership, individual contributors, everybody that ends up participating in these. And, my other client I had mentioned, that was one of their biggest complaints. The point person there is basically explaining that, I sit in these sales update meetings every single week, and we don't really talk about anything that's going to drive or change the outcome. And, I basically just said, it's like, so why are you meeting? Like, what's the point, right? If the point is to just talk about, well, we didn't make any progress, that's probably a waste of everybody's time. If the point is to say, here's what all of the actions that I took this week resulted in, and if those results are less than desired, right? If they fall outside of what we've identified as this is what we want, right? Our target, then we can focus all our energy and effort to understand and ultimately change, right? Influence those actions. So this is, my encouragement for you to take a look at what you're measuring and how often you're meeting, and really start to give some more thought around what the intended outcome of this is. And my guess is ultimately that you'll find yourself revising metrics, reducing the total amount of time that you and your team is spending in meetings, and you'll more than likely have far more effective, like for whatever time you do meet, far more effective conversations, because everybody is now not just understanding, what the intended kind of greater good outcome is, but, how do we zoom in? How do we help, by providing additional resources? How do we ultimately help to, change or influence those action steps or action items that are being taken? We can focus all of our energy and effort, all of our collective brain power into putting resource towards solving that problem, right? And it's probably the coolest thing that, that I get to witness. I have one client that has been working on this progressively now for several months, and it's really, really cool to see the result side of that, where, it's not just about what gets measured, but then unpacking, what that gap is, understanding, and that's what's taken some time, right? Understanding what should be measured. We have an idea, but let's measure it. Then let's talk about it. Let's refine that list. And they've been doing the work to be able to do that. And it's really fun now to see the outcome because not only are we driving towards the kind of target metrics that have been identified, but now we have real things to talk about and the ability to again provide that collective brain power towards solving or closing the gap, said a different way. And the other thing that kind of goes without being said, you may or may not know this, but most of the time when these metrics and things are being identified and ultimately discussed, right? It's no secret to the team, and said a different way, if you identify a particular metric, like let's say, quote win rate, right? Like I'll pick on that one as a typical, metric that gets talked about. But, if that's your particular metric and you've got that target, there's a bunch of different ways to influence that, right? There is, that's just the easiest way to say it. And so, the adage of, you can only, only improve what gets measured. I always forget, butcher that saying, you can only manage what gets measured, whatever it is, the quote I'm talking about. But my point is just that, you have to be cautious because people understand across the org, if the, if this particular KPI is the thing that's most important to people, I got to figure out a way to influence that. So, that's why, again, this stuff takes a bit of work, right? If we're talking about, let's start measuring, the amount of activity, because activity ultimately, will lead us to close deals. And, that is very true in a variety of circumstances. But the thing that particular KPI ultimately reinforces is, let me track this outreach in every single turn of the conversation, right? And the reality of it is that just because all of those conversations happened, right, all of the turns of the email happened, it doesn't mean that we are any closer to booked meeting, right? So that's where the difference between activity and, intended result, right? Like we know that if we get people into a conversation, the likelihood of us building trust, the likelihood of us, getting additional opportunities, the likelihood of us, ultimately closing business is far greater than if we're just making phone calls, sending emails, sending direct messages, connecting with people. Right. So we have to be mindful of, the specific KPI that we ultimately settle on so that we're not just reinforcing busy work, right? And that we're ultimately seeking to best understand how we can take action to influence the greater good, right? So back to the example of how this whole thing started, that happened to be in an engineering department and taking a look at the backlog of that particular engineering department, right? So if we would have just gone straight away on the metrics, it would have looked like the action we would have needed to take was put additional resources there and, make sure that we could actually get through that work. And the reality was the actual order queue was very low. It just happened to be we had a very complex order that came in during that time. And the reality is that complex order takes a lot longer to process through that particular touch point. So again, understanding how all of this stuff ultimately connects between prompting action and achieving desired greater good goal. So how do you know if this stuff is happening, right? A couple of ways from my perspective. One, if you sit in any type of, KPI dashboard update meeting and you constantly are kind of saying like, what are we doing, right? Like, why are we talking about this same thing time and time again? If you don't have any concrete actual numbers to be able to review, Another great, indicator that there could be something wrong, right? If there's no change from week to week or month to month, however you're ultimately monitoring and reviewing these things, another great indicator that you've got some more work to do around these things. And then you want to be asking, like, is this reporting the news, right? Like, do we have the ability to take action to influence this for the next time, right? And the next time could be next week. The next time could be next month. Next time could be next quarter, again, depending on your meeting cadence. But if it's telling you the news, like this already happened, we have no way to influence it moving forward, chances are you're dealing with a lagging indicator and you've not settled in on some sort of KPI that's actually going to be more in a predictive state, help you kind of think about like speed to value, right? So it's like help you take action faster. So if I see something that is outside of our target window, again, we'll pick on the booked meetings. If our target is to book 10 meetings a week, and for the last 2 weeks we've booked 3 meetings, that's an action item, right? Like, what are we doing to increase the number of booked meetings? And then you'll hear about all the activity that has been going on. So then we can start to take a look at the activity and start to, put our collective brain power towards changing those activities, because obviously those activities aren't resulting in the outcome that we'd like to see. So how can we influence that outcome, right? It's not just to say, well, let's just do more, because, we may already have been doing a lot, but we may have already been doing a lot completely ineffectively, which means that we're not getting the intended outcome that we're ultimately trying to go after, right? So those are a few things to be on the lookout for. And then in terms of, what do you actually do to change this stuff, right? Be thinking about what's an action I can take. If you see a metric that's outside of your target area, the next natural question is, what can I do to influence this for our next meeting, right? And if you really struggle to answer that, then chances are you need to again, kind of zoom out and do a bit more work around, is this the right metric to be tracking to begin with? That's the real work that goes into this. And, as I mentioned earlier, it's ultimately a very iterative process, in the sense that just because you pick one doesn't mean you've picked it at the right level. Back to how this conversation started, right? And it doesn't mean it's the correct one either. So you need to go through this process. You need to work with the team collaboratively to talk through, is this something that falls into the leading indicators bucket? Do we need lagging indicators, or are we okay at our regular, let's say monthly, quarterly intervals to check all of our regular lagging indicators, right? Because we're doing the work ahead of time. We're shifting from being, reactive to proactive, in the sense that since we're talking about this leading indicator on a more, more proactive cadence, right? Like that we can actually do something to influence it before we see those results in our lagging indicator. So as a reminder, each one of these solo episodes is an extension of our free weekly newsletter, Business System Saturday. So I'd encourage you to go take a look at that on the website and sign up for that if you're getting any value out of these solo episodes. And appreciate you for tuning in, and catch you on the next episode. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.